So I am very pleased to introduce this morning Fallon Melander. Fallon is a lawyer. She lives in Burlington with her husband, Eric, and her children. And Fallon also sits on the Halton Community Legal Services Board, a board upon which I sit as well. And that is where Fallon and I met a number of years ago. Fallon is shared with me a few years ago her story, and that was a profoundly moving story that Fallon had always known that she had an Indigenous background, but knew little about it. But over the years, she has come to claim her Indigenous heritage and tells a very, very moving and powerful story that I am so pleased that Fallon has agreed to share with us today on this National Indigenous Peoples Day. So Fallon, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to hearing from you. And at the conclusion of our time today, Fallon has also agreed to stay on in the breakout rooms to chat with us after the service today. So Fallon, thank you again for being here.
Great, thank you very much to everyone. Apologies, as Michael mentioned, I am a mother and I have 3 children upstairs right above me who I can hear crying right now. So if you hear crying, I know you're probably all used to it. But I wanted to also thank Michael for his kind words and an opportunity to share my story. It comes at a very, heightened time right now with what we have learned, us as Indigenous peoples. It wasn't news to us about the unmarked graves of the children being found, but I think it's been sent a shockwave through the nation and through the world. But it's also come at a time to be able to speak and share a little bit about my family and our story, in that we recently lost my grandmother to COVID, unfortunately, back in the end of April. So I'm happy to tell you a little bit about her to hopefully honor her story and to bring awareness as well, because her journey also touches in Oakville, which is where I know your church is located. So my grandmother is a residential school survivor. We are from Wikwamacong First Nation, which is located on the beautiful Manitoulin Island. I didn't meet my grandmother until I was a child, and that is because my mother is a survivor of the 60s scoop. And she was taken as a 4-year-old child away from her mother and placed with a lovely family in Oakville. And that family was the sweetest, most caring, kind family who is still my family to this day, but had no idea and understanding of the child that they had adopted, other than they wanted to provide a loving home. So my mother, being 4, 5 years old, knew where she came from, had memories of her own family, and struggled. She also struggled living in Oakville, where, in the 60s at the time, and you can still say today, there was racism, discrimination, and lack of understanding, especially at that time, about who Indigenous peoples are. So my mother grew up, she struggled her whole life, and then she had me. And in meeting my father, she was able to actually reconnect with her mother, who she had been taken from several years ago. The story is almost fate, whatever you want to call it. But my grandmother, Christine, who's a residential school survivor, was actually living in Oakville at the time. She was living close to where my mom grew up with her adopted family as a superintendent of a building. And through my father's mother, had connected with my grandmother and was able to reunite my mom and her mother back together. That started, obviously, for my mom, a huge healing journey and an opportunity to connect with her mother. But also at that time, we had no understanding of why my mother had been taken. We had no understanding of why my grandmother had not been raised or gone to school with in her home community or with her parents. We knew about the school that my grandmother attended through stories she shared with my mother. We knew about my mother being taken and adopted into a non-Indigenous family and other Indigenous people she had met along the way, but we didn't know why. So me as a little girl growing up in Oakville, not seeing myself reflected back, not understanding, why my grandmother and mother were not raised with their parents and their family, internalized this in the only way I knew how, that Indigenous people, my grandmother and her parents, were just bad parents. And as I grew up and I saw more and more Indigenous peoples displaced, homeless, marginalized, it started for me as a child and then a young or a teenager to say something's not right here. But again, being very isolated in Oakville and not having that exposure to our reserves or our nations or the proud and wonderful culture that we have. So it wasn't actually until I went to university that I took a course, which is to me very ironic, but I took a course in Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I learned about the residential school system, and I learned about the 60 scoop, and I learned about the Canadian policies that my family had been part of, not by choice. And I actually learned that it wasn't us, and it wasn't my grandmother or her parents that made these decisions, but that these decisions were made for my family members. And I remember running out of that class as a 20-year-old and calling my mom and breaking down in tears and telling her that it wasn't our fault. And my mom obviously knew this. She didn't know the extent of it. And I think as Canada and even as Indigenous peoples, we're learning more and more the extent of the policy and the laws and the harms that were placed. But that was a big wake-up moment for me, and a big moment of releasing shame and releasing my identity as something that was not to be proud of. And it was something that was a stereotype or was what we saw in the media. And from there, I made a decision that I was going to learn about my culture. I was going to embrace it. And I was also going to make a career to ensure that I could have positive change. So from university, I then attended law school. And again, looking back, very naive, but thought, law is the way, law, you can change the laws. Definitely gave me a great background and gave me a lot of experience. But I also, I think, learned even more about how difficult and how big the laws have played in Indigenous people's lives and other groups' lives as well. So I did attend law school, graduated, and then worked for Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto for quite a while, working with clients, working with peoples who had been displaced, homeless, police complaints. From there, I moved on to Legal Aid Ontario, where I led the Aboriginal Justice Strategy and was able to provide advice and policy work around legal aid services to Indigenous peoples across Ontario, and was able to travel across, the northern parts of Ontario down to the southern parts. I have moved on. I had twins, and that definitely stopped a little bit of travel for me and ability. I also have a daughter as well who's 3 years older than the twins. So I'm currently at Metrolinx, leading their Indigenous relations strategy as well, working in a whole new level around expansion of transit. But I've also learned there about the impacts and the understanding and how the knowledge around Indigenous peoples and lands and relationships brushes right across from coast to coast and also from any type of industry and work, because there's a big gap in understanding about who we are as Indigenous peoples. And I'm finding that there are a lot of people who want to learn. And I'm so happy that I have children now who are 6 and 3 who are learning. They're proud. This is the first generation where they are being told the positive things about being an Indigenous person. They are learning about their culture in a positive way. They are seeing it reflected now in their education that they are learning. They're celebrating Indigenous History Month and People's Day. All those things that I never had an opportunity to do as a child. And I just wanted to share my story. I know that in Halton, it's come out now, and my mom has done a lot of work. There were a lot of children who were placed here during the 60s scoop. There are community members who came here, like my grandmother. My grandmother knew that some of her children had been placed in the Oakville, Halton area and came here to find her children, but also made a small community here. And we're here, we're thriving. We are trying to reclaim our roots. And there is a growing momentum of community, which I'm starting to see in Halton as well. I know Michael has been working with Grandmother's Voice and other community members within Halton. So we can start seeing and celebrating the gifts and the strengths and resiliency of Indigenous peoples here today. So if you look around more, and hopefully as the years go on, we will start to see that more, and we will start to see the youth embrace, be proud, and we continue that resiliency that we've seen. So I just want to thank you all for letting me share my story and my grandmother's story, who I honor, and I know she is proud. She's come full circle. And my mother's story as well, who has agreed to allow me to share it today. So thank you very much.